I really wish multi-stream worked on TikTok. They have this thing called multi-stream where on my software, it allows you to see multiple chats at one time. But whenever you do it, it's like you can see YouTube within the software, but you can only load up TikTok in another screen. So that's kind of what I'm looking at right now. So I have to look at two different screens while trying to monitor the chat. Hey guys, how you doing, everyone? I will be getting started in a second. As usual, a little bit late today, but tonight's lecture is going to be a little bit longer than what yesterday's was because yesterday's lecture, I think, was about 18 minutes overall. But as I explained to everybody, I was dealing with quite a bit yesterday. So dealing with the death of a friend, dealing with a little child that decided to stick a Lego up her nose, had to get her to the emergency room because she decided to sniff the thing way back to her nasal cavity, and have guests today as well, but there's like a little bit of everything going on. So today has been a little bit chill, just trying to get my bearings together. And this is part 3, lecture 3 of this week. And this is systemic racism, the roots of inequality. So the things that we're talking about today is systemic racism, mental health, and resistance. So that's the last lecture in the series, and hopefully we can just kind of go ahead, deep dive into this. I'm just going to give it a few minutes because I know some people are going to catch up a little bit late. Then I'm going to have those people that's going to be like, "Oh, I missed it," and I'm gonna have to tell them it's recorded. But otherwise, this is definitely more of the heavier part of the series because we had lecture 1, and we kind of worked our way through that. And lecture 1 was racial battle fatigue, which is basically all of our documentation, all of our research and stuff that I put in the class with regards to the book and to these empirical studies. And then we covered racial trauma and intergenerational stress yesterday. And then today is systemic racism, mental health, and resistance. So this is part of the class, Roots of Racism, Bias, Prejudice, and Systemic Oppression. It is a very heavy class. It is a very involved class. It requires us to do work, whether you're Black, white, indigenous, Hispanic, whether you're from the United States or overseas, whether you are African American, whether you're Black, whether you're from Caribbean, whether you're from Africa, it doesn't matter. So this is one of those classes where we get to talk about these issues. During that first week, we defined what systemic oppression is, what bias is, what discrimination, prejudice, racism, colorism, classism. We defined all that stuff in week 1. And then we went into week 2. In week 2, we got into The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And then from there, we went over into week 3 and we got into Bias by Jennifer Eberhard. And then from week 3, we went into week 4 and we discussed Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. And all of this was kind of like heavy hitting stuff, especially in week 3 when we started looking at 13th by Ava DuVernay. And so when you start reading about this stuff, some of the stuff for people who don't experience it and people who never see it, it was heavy hitting. And we did the implicit association test. And so some of us, we kind of went through that process on understanding our own biases. And then as we kind of went through that, we had to, we had a discussion on it. So today we're going to kind of, continue this conversation. We're into lecture 3. This is going to be the last lecture for the week, and I'll probably put up some highlights after that, but I don't see myself doing any other videos that's going to be as deep as this because this takes a lot of energy, to be quite honest with you. For people that actually live this, that they experience it, they deal with the bias, they deal with the racism, they deal with the outcomes. We can see the intergenerational stress. We can see, epigenetics at work and how we interact with people and how we interact with others, even when it comes down to the police or just going grocery shopping. We get to see all of this stuff and we get to interact with all this stuff. And for people who are people of color, who are Black, we experience it. So me talking about it is one thing. It just gives you the scientific version of what we already know about ourselves. So this is not anything new. I know that some people are joining here. I appreciate you guys, but this isn't, kind of like, I'm not going to be trying to talk at you. I'm going to just try to inform you and try to teach you with regards to what's going on and give it a name. So over the last two lectures, we've talked about racial battle fatigue, the daily exhaustion that comes from navigating racism. And we've talked about racial trauma, how history leaves a mark and how the past is never really the past. But today, we're going to talk about something a little bit bigger. We're going to talk about something that shapes where we live, where we work, what opportunities we have, and yes, even how long we live. And that is systemic racism. And just to give you guys a head up, because this one is talking about systemic racism, mental health, and resistance, I'm going to break up this lecture into like 3 subparts. So the first one is going to be systemic racism. And why racism specifically? Because mainly that's what this class is about. We are to get down to the roots of bias and the roots of racism. And it's not just about how individuals say hateful things. We define racism in the first course, in that first week, and we were talking about what is the difference between prejudice and what is the difference between racism. And what we talked about is that racism is basically prejudice plus power. So it's not just about one person making life harder for another person. Racism is built into the very systems we rely on every day, whether you're talking about the social systems, welfare, where you're talking about, just grocery shopping, where you're talking about the judicial system. It is built into everything that we interact with. It is in the schools, it is in the hospitals, it is in the courtrooms. You see it in the job market. You see it everywhere, and it's been there for a very long time. We have gotten into what Jim Crow looked like. We talked about the black codes during that first week. We talked about all of this stuff the first 2 weeks, as a matter of fact. So we're going to continue this talk. We're going to get into it. We're going to talk about it. So a lot of folks think of racism as just a personal issue, as a matter of just bad people with bad attitudes. You can remove every openly racist person from power today, and the system will keep working exactly as it was designed to work. That's the reality of it. You can remove every racist person, the system is going to continue working, because it is not about individuals. Because systemic racism is not about individual prejudice. It's about policies. It's about laws. It's about institutions that have historically advantaged some and disadvantaged others. So you get to see it in who gets access to get good schools, for instance, who gets approved for a home loan, who gets stopped by the police, and who gets access to quality health care. You get to see all of this stuff. And these aren't just accidents. These are the outcomes that are deliberate choices made over generations. This came about long before you. It came about long before me. It came about long before our parents and our grandparents. These are systems that have been in place. So let's go back to some of those discussions that we had in week 2 and week 3. Because if we want to understand systemic racism, we need to understand basically how it was built. And when we're talking about how it was built, we need to know the history. And this is why we went over stuff like the new Jim Crow. We went over bias. We went over just mercy. We went over 13th. So after slavery ended, we had Jim Crow laws, keeping Black Americans out of jobs, out of schools, out of voting booths. Then came redlining. And this is where banks started refusing to give home loans to Black families, keeping entire neighborhoods segregated. Then came mass incarceration, a system that found new ways to police and criminalize Black and brown communities. Remember, one of the first things I told you about is like from the 1960s, we had an incarceration rate of 300,000. Then all of a sudden, 1990s, that shot up to 2 million. And this is why we started getting into the 13th Amendment, because it was all about that one little line, except if convicted of a crime. That is how they legalized slavery. This is how they institutionalize this new racial caste. So, what is the result of all of this? Well, today the average black family has 1/10 the wealth of the average white family. Schools in predominantly black and brown neighborhoods get thousands of dollars less per student than majority white schools. Black mothers are 3 to 4 times more likely to die during childbirth than white mothers, even when income and education levels are the same. And if people don't really understand this or really believe this, go back and read about what happened to Serena Williams when she gave birth to her child and how she almost lost her life. Even as somebody as famous as she is, has as much money as she does, she almost lost her life. So at every step, at every turn, new policies were put in place to ensure that the racial wealth gap didn't close, that access to opportunities remained uneven. So you have to really understand that this isn't a coincidence. This is the systemic racism that I have been talking about for the last 5 weeks now. This is not a coincidence. This stuff didn't just pop up out of nowhere. So somebody out there has to be saying, but what about personal responsibility? What about hard work? What about this, having a merit system? And let's be clear, hard work matters. Education matters. Personal choices matter. But you can work as hard as you want, and if the system is rigged against you, it is still an uphill climb. It's like playing a game where the other team got a 400-year head start, but people still act surprised when the score isn't even. You see people love to say, we had a black president. We have black CEOs. Doesn't that prove that the systems work? Well, no, it doesn't. Not at all. Individual success does not erase systemic barriers. One person breaking through the ceiling doesn't mean that the ceiling doesn't exist. And let's be honest, those who make it, they don't make it because of the system. They make it in spite of it. So what does that mean for us? What does that mean for us right now, right at this moment? It means that every time we see a racial disparity, whether it's in income, health, education, criminal justice, our first question should not be, what are people doing wrong? Our first question should be, what policies, what structures, what systems are creating this outcome? Because the system is working exactly the way it was designed to work. And that means if we want different results, we need a different system. So in talking about systemic racism, it's not about guilt and it's not about blame. That's not what any of this is about. I'm not trying to get up here and say, hey, white people should feel bad because of, where we are today. None of this is what matters at the moment. What I'm trying to do is get everybody to get to the point that is about understanding. Because if we can understand how the system was built, then we can start talking about how to rebuild it. But if people aren't educated enough about how the system was built, why it existed, any of that, we can't actually talk about dismantling it. It's great that, we can sit up here and we can look at the steps that Obama made and how, Kamala ran and everything else, but it's not about that. And so we need to talk about where to go next. So as I told you, this is 3 parts. So in the second part of this lecture, let's go ahead and start talking about mental health. And then we're going to go into resistance. So we just covered systemic racism, how it was built into the foundations of our institutions, how it shapes opportunities, wealth, and justice. But let's talk about the next consequence, because all of these are consequences. Whether you're talking about systemic racism, mental health, we're going to talk about the consequences, and that's what this next thing is. So this is one that doesn't always make the headlines. It only makes the headlines if you're a certain color and you shot up something and they're trying to defend why you did it. But for us, it's something more real. And that's about mental health. And this is one of those areas where I spend so much time talking about it. I've done several interviews on radio shows and television and newscasts basically on mental health alone, because we got other things that affect our mental health, whether it's adverse childhood experiences or whatever. We have our own issues that when it comes down to this, because when you are constantly navigating a system that wasn't built for you, when you are dealing with discrimination, barriers, and biases every day, it doesn't affect your wallet. It just doesn't affect your wallet. It affects your neighborhood. But it doesn't just affect your neighborhood either. It affects your mind. It affects your body. We talked about that yesterday, about how when we get into discussing things with regards to intergenerational stress, it is something that is deep into our genes. So it affects not only your mind, it affects your body, it affects your ability to sleep, it affects your ability to focus, it affects your ability to feel safe or to feel whole. And so that's one of the reasons that we need to talk about this as well. So let's start with the facts, right? Black Americans, indigenous communities, Latino and Asian Americans, we all experience higher rates of depression, anxiety, PTSD-like symptoms than our white counterparts. We all experience this. Thanks, Close Peg. So that's why I've often pushed this whole narrative that it's not necessarily about, one race versus the other, because some of us are all in the same boat. So when you think about it, when you live in a country where your existence is constantly questioned, that's stress. When your name on a job application lowers your chances of getting hired, that's stress. Why do you think so many Indian people come over here and say, my name is John, or my name is David, or you have Asian Americans that say, oh, my name is Bob, my name is Bill. And you even have other people, you have black people that they're afraid to put names like Lakeisha on their application, because we've already had studies that said if you have a certain name, you're going to, and you have somebody else with a different name, a white sounding name, that you're already going to get less callbacks than what the other person will. We went over these studies in weeks 2 and 3. But also, when you worry about your child being treated unfairly at school, about whether you'll get followed to, going into the store, about whether police could stop and turn something into something worse, that's trauma. And so here's what we know, that stress over time changes the brain. So how do you think we get the cope? How do you think we go through life if we already know that we're already dealing with epigenetics, we're already dealing with stress, we're already dealing with all these other things that come with just being a person of color? And none of this is theoretical. All of this is science. This is all backed by empirical studies. So we know that it changes the brain. It raises cortisol levels. It wears down the immune system. It increases the risk of heart disease, diabetes, and mental illness. We know this because there are studies about it. So we see it in the research, and we see it in the data. We see it in our communities. And when you start thinking about PTSD in the context of war, soldiers go to a battle. They witness violence. They live in constant fear. And when they come home, the nervous system is constantly still in survival mode. But what happens when the battlefield is your daily life? When you're dealing with racial profiling, with discrimination in healthcare, with being the only person of color in a room and having to prove over and over that you belong. What happens when every time you turn on the news, you see another person who looks like you being denied justice? You don't think that all of these videos that we see, you don't think the George Floyd video didn't have an impact on us? You don't think that all of these other shootings didn't have an impact on us, or the news didn't have an impact on us? All of this stuff has an impact on us, and it gets buried deep down inside of us, and we have to relive this trauma every single day. Because you see something like that happen, and then when you go out there and you have a run-in with police or whatever, that's the first thing you're thinking about. It's like, what's going to happen to me? This is the same PTSD that soldiers deal with, but this is from racism. And for many people of color, the symptoms are the same. Hypervigilance, always on guard, waiting for the next moment of discrimination. It happens. Emotional exhaustion, because racism is exhausting. Avoidance, choosing not to enter certain places or spaces because you don't feel safe. Numbness, because when you experience too much pain, sometimes you shut down just to survive. And again, this isn't just about the individual. Generations of racial trauma gets passed down. And this is what we talked about with epigenetics yesterday. Generations of racial discrimination gets passed down. We talked about this the last time. Intergenerational stress, epigenetics. And when your ancestors lived through slavery, through segregation, through state violence, that trauma doesn't disappear. That's why I said yesterday, you can't just say, why do you still focus on this? Why don't you just move on? We can't, because it's already ingrained into us. It echoes. It shapes how families raise their children, how communities relate to law enforcement, how people navigate a world that for centuries has told them their lives don't matter as much. This has been the experience of Black people, people of color, minorities, indigenous communities, Asians, Hispanics. This has been the issue in this country for centuries. And that does something to your mental health. So one might ask, right? If racial trauma is real, if racism affects mental health, why don't people just get help? And that's a good question, because the reality is mental health care in this country is not built for everyone. Therapists don't always understand racial trauma. A lot of people go to therapy, they try to talk about racism, and a therapist says, maybe you're just being too sensitive. Then there's the stigma. Many communities of color have been taught to push through, to be strong. That going to therapy means that you're weak. I'm not sure how many people in the Black community has heard that we don't go to talk to people. We don't go to somebody outside of our community to talk about our issues. Then there's the lack of access. Black and brown communities are less likely to have affordable, culturally competent mental health services. Has anybody, especially if you're Black, have you tried to go out there and find a therapist, one that can understand you, only to realize that the majority of the therapists do not look like you, do not understand your experiences? cannot relate to you on any level, how is that going to affect you? You're not going to get the help that you need because they don't understand where you're coming from. And when you combine all of that, it's no wonder people suffer in silence. So here's these questions that, so what do we do? Because acknowledging the problem is one thing and solving it is another. And we need solutions at every level. Oh, I know just how you feel, Josh. I've had to fire several therapists before. You have to keep trying and trying and trying. And if you're dealing with certain healthcare systems and insurance, they're going to assign somebody to you without you being able to pick out one yourself. And that sucks. So we need solutions at every level. We need more mental health professionals who understand racial traumas. This means better training. This means more Black and brown therapists. This is one of the things that I was talking about yesterday. We need people to go into these spaces because we don't have enough people. This means that therapy that doesn't just focus on the individual, but on the systems that create these conditions in the first place. We need to break the stigma. We need to talk about mental health because talking about it shouldn't be taboo. I spend a lot of my time in the Baltimore area talking about stigma in the workplace. And so as we continue talking about the stigma in the workplace, we're trying to break down these systems so that people can actually have these discussions. You shouldn't be afraid to say, hey, you know what? I've lost someone. I'm feeling down. I'm very sad. You shouldn't be ashamed of that. Or if you're dealing with anxiety, you shouldn't be ashamed to have that conversation. And seeking therapy should not be seen as a weakness. It should be seen as survival. It should be seen as resistance. We also need policy changes because it's not enough to tell people to just get help. What is that going to do to just say, hey, you just need to go and get help? If mental health care is expensive, inaccessible, or culturally incompetent, we need more funding. We need more community-based programs. We need more therapists that take insurance. Because I can tell you right now, I've gone to therapists and they'd be like, we don't accept any of the insurance, and it's $120 per session. And I'm suggesting that you do at least one session a week. That becomes expensive. Very, very expensive. And when you are Black or you're a person of color or you're indigenous or whatever the case, and you don't have the same access to health care as everybody else, you can't afford it. If racism is a public health crisis, then mental health care is part of the solution. So when we talk about systemic racism, we talked about racial trauma, and we're not just talking about the past, we're talking about people's lives right now. And for far too long, this country has treated racism like a policy debate, like an academic discussion. And that's definitely what this isn't about. It's like, I'm here to teach you about it, but I'm also here to tell you, hey, we need to do better. And I need you guys to step up and start thinking about how we can do better. How can we break down these systems? Because for millions of people, this is not an abstract issue. It is not a history lesson. It's their reality. Because in the final part of this lecture, the one I'm just about to get into, we're going to talk about resistance and about how people fight back, how they reclaim their joy, their health, their future. So stick with me because we're going to go through this last section and hopefully we'll get through it quickly. So we, just as a recap, we talked about systemic racism and how discrimination isn't just about individuals. but about entire systems over generation. We talked about mental health and how racism takes a toll on the mind, the body, and the soul. And so now we're going to go into resistance, because here's the thing: oppression is real, but so is the fight against it. And if history has taught us anything, it's that no matter how deep the injustice, no matter how overwhelming the challenge, people find a way to push back. They organize, they speak out, they build communities, they resist. And if anybody has been following my page for any amount of time, I have a note up there, and that last note says resist. And that resistance, it can come in many forms. So we're going to start with something simple. We're going to start with something personal, because resistance isn't just about marching in the streets. It's also about survival. It's about healing. It's about refusing to let racism break you. Taking care of your mental health, that's resistance. Because a system that wants to wear you down, that wants you to feel hopeless, like what is going on right now, a system that wants you to feel hopeless, that system loses when you prioritize your well-being. I want y'all to remember that. A system that wants to wear you down and that wants you to feel hopeless, that system loses when you prioritize your well-being. Resting, guess what? That's resistance as well. See, resistance isn't always about going out there and protesting and doing whatever. No, resting, that's resistance. Because for centuries, marginalized communities have been told that they have to work twice as hard, hustle twice as much just to survive. Choosing rest is choosing to say, I deserve peace and I deserve joy. You prioritize yourself. And something that is very personal to me, very, very personal to me, educating yourself, like sitting up here in this lecture, that's resistance as well. Because when you understand history, when you recognize the patterns, when you see how the game is rigged, you become harder to fool, harder to manipulate, harder to silence. And sometimes resistance is as simple as showing up as yourself. Walking into that boardroom, stepping out onto that campus, holding your head high in spaces that weren't built for you, and saying, I belong here. That's resistance. So we looked at the personal aspect of things, but let's zoom out a little bit now. Let's zoom out just a little bit. Because while personal resistance is powerful, real change happens when people come together. So throughout history, marginalized communities have built networks of support, of activism, of power. You see some of this happening right now. When you start looking at some of the actions of AOC and Jasmine Crockett and some of the other people that was kind of coming together, and they speaking against this. And we see it again and again. Let's go back to the 50s and 60s when we have the civil rights movement. You had young people, and you had faith leaders, you had activists. They were all standing together, demanding justice, changing laws. You had the Black Panther Party, not just fighting police brutality, but feeding children. A lot of people don't understand that, the free lunch program in this country came about because of the Black Panthers. The government did not like what they were doing. They were out there feeding the community. And if you don't know about this history, I implore you to go and read. They were opening clinics. They were providing education. A lot of people don't understand that. They think that the Black Panthers are just going around with their guns, standing up against police and stuff like that. That was not it. They were in the community providing a civil service for the communities that they were part of. And then you have the disability rights movement. Folks chaining their wheelchairs to buses, crawling up the Capitol steps, demanding their right to exist in public spaces. And then you had the indigenous land defenders, because I can't leave them out. Protecting sacred lands, resisting environmental destruction, protecting water, keeping the cultures alive. And today, that same spirit of resistance lives on in the streets, in the classrooms, even online, even on TikTok. We have mutual aid networks. We got grassroots movements, Black Lives Matter, Stop Asian Hate, indigenous sovereignty movements. Because when systems fail us, guess what? We build our own. And that's something I am definitely pushing for. The system right now is failing everybody. Black, white, indigenous, Hispanic, Asian, it doesn't matter. It is failing everybody currently in this country at this very moment, at this very time with our current government. It is failing everybody. I don't care who you are. And unless you're a millionaire or billionaire, guess what? The system has failed you already. It has failed you and it's going to continue to fail you at least over the next 4 years. Get used to it. But when the systems fail, we build our own. That is one thing that in itself, that is power. So marching, protesting, that's important. That moves the needle. But we also need people inside of the system. Changing the policies, changing the institutions, changing the laws. That means that some of you guys out there should be running for office so that you can actually affect change. We need teachers. We need doctors. We need lawyers. We need journalists. We need elected officials. When you're looking at teachers, we need folks who rewrite the curriculum so that generation knows the truth. Because I can tell you what they're doing in some states down in the South. They are rewriting history. They're sitting up here saying January 6th didn't happen and that, it was Antifa loyalists that were, integrated and they were causing the violence. And then you also have the history where people are saying, there was no transatlantic slave trade. These people came over as indentured servants. And then we need doctors who push for better health care, who refuse to let Black mothers keep dying at higher rates. We need to be able to have women doctors who can look at another Black woman and say, I know exactly what you need. We're going to take care of you. We are not going to let you die. We need lawyers who fight against discriminatory policies in court. Because we can't expect other people to fight for us. It doesn't matter if you are Black, brown, indigenous, Hispanic, Asian. It doesn't matter. We need people to be able to fight for that discrimination. We need journalists who tell stories of the mainstream media that the mainstream media tries to ignore. All of these independent journalists that's been popping up over TikTok, I love it. One of the ones I follow is a Black woman. She puts up her stuff in Spanish and she puts it in English and, her captions or whatever. And I listen to her talk when she's feeding the news because you can't expect everybody else to put your issues as a priority and at heart. Because they'll sit up here and show pictures of you being abused and then telling the world that you enjoy it. We need elected officials who don't just talk about change, but legislate it. Because I'm personally tired about people just talking about what they can't do. And I would love for them to talk about what they can do. Because listen, the system isn't going to fix itself. If we want better policies, we want better protection, we have to be the ones to make them. And that means getting involved. That means voting. That means running for office. That means organizing in the workplace. Because the truth is, no movement ever succeeded by just hoping things got better. It succeeded because people made it happen. So here's something I want to leave you guys with. And if you've been on this long, I appreciate it. Thank you very much. And I hope that everybody was able to learn something, but this is what I would like to leave you with. Every step forward, every right, every opportunity, every freedom that marginalized people have today, somebody fought for it. It wasn't just given to you. Somebody fought for it. Whether you're looking at leaders of the past, whether it's leaders of the present, somebody fought for it. For every right, every opportunity, every freedom that we have today. Somebody risked their job. Somebody risked their reputation, their safety. Somebody refused to accept things as they are. And because they fought, because they resisted, we stand here today. So the question is, what will we do with that legacy? Because resistance is not just about looking back, it's about looking forward. It's about honoring the struggles of those who came before us by fighting for those who will come after us. I'll repeat that. Resistance is about honoring the struggle of those who came before us by fighting for those who will come after us. So whether it's in your personal life, your community, or within the system itself, I want everybody to find your way to resist. And never forget, oppression is strong, but the people are stronger. Thank you very much, guys, and I appreciate you guys joining today, and let's keep pushing forward. Next week, we'll be getting into week 6. Then we have week 7, and week 8 is more of a capstone. But I'm going to keep having these conversations. I'm going to keep having these talks. The next class that I'm going to be looking at this summer is going to be the psychology of resistance and how resistance movements actually come to be and how they become successful as well. Just a quick check-in. Does anybody have any questions? Because if you have some questions, I would like to answer them as best I can. And if not, then if you missed the lecture, this is Roots of Racism. The lecture is up on, is being streamed to YouTube as well. It's being recorded to YouTube. All of my lectures from this week, lectures 1, 2, and 3 as today, they are up there, but all of my past lectures are up there as well. So all of my lectures with regards to this class, Roots of Racism, Bias, Prejudice, and Systemic Oppression. This is week 5 for us. Week 1, we spent time going over what racism, discrimination, prejudice, the differences between all of that stuff. The class is open to everybody. It's not limited to any particular race, to any particular ethnicity. We're talking to everybody. We're having these discussions. And we watched 13th by Ava DuVernay. We read a couple of chapters out of The New Jim Crow. We read a couple of chapters out of Bias by Jennifer Eberhardt. Last week we got into Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson. For those who could, they went ahead, they watched the movie that was about, and just kind of follow up, because a lot of this stuff, it is heavy. And I've told people when we first started, not everybody has to participate, but if you join the class, just understand that it is going to take work. It is going to be heavy. Some people are going to have different experiences than others. And because we have these different experiences, I need people to understand that you have to be able to learn how to communicate in a way that's not going to be offensive to anybody else. Because we all come from different backgrounds. And I've mentioned before, a class with 800 people in it, yes, you're probably going to bump heads somewhere. But what I want people to understand is that we have people from Switzerland and Sweden and the Netherlands and New Zealand and Australia and Korea and China and across South America, from Brazil, Argentina, Peru. We have people from everywhere because people are trying to understand this, because this isn't just an American issue. The fact that it happens in America doesn't mean that Afro Latinos don't have to deal with it in their countries. It doesn't mean that people ain't having to deal with colorism in the Caribbean. It doesn't mean that Black Jews don't have to deal with it in Israel and throughout Palestine. It doesn't mean any of this stuff. So I want people to understand that this is a global issue. We're talking about it from an American standpoint and American context, but it is a global issue. I want people to understand that, and that's why we keep using the frame of the United States, because the United States is probably one of the best and worst examples that we could possibly use, because if it's happening here, it can happen anywhere else. Otherwise, if there are no questions, I thank you all for joining. I appreciate it. The class is available. It is free. You can get to it by the link in my profile. You can get to YouTube lecture. If you've missed the majority of it, or if you didn't get a chance to see it, you can be able to go back there and watch it. It'll be up as soon as this thing is over with. And so other than that, you guys have a good night, and I'll see you around. Take care, everyone, and have a good weekend.